People often say love is measured by what you're willing to give up. If that's true, then I gave away an entire lifetime. My name is Margaret Collins, and on the morning of my 70th birthday, I believed I was one of the luckiest women alive. By sunset, I wasn't sure I knew my own grandson anymore. But before I tell you what happened that day, you need to understand how we got there. Because no one wakes up one morning and discovers the child they raised has become a stranger. It happens one small choice at a time. 26 years earlier, the phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. Nobody calls at that hour with good news. I remember fumbling through the darkness trying not to wake my husband, Robert. The voice on the other end belonged to a state trooper. "Mrs. Collins?" "Yes. I'm very sorry to tell you this." The rest of his sentence became a blur. There had been an accident. A drunk driver. Rain. A bridge. My daughter Emily and her husband Daniel never made it home. The only survivor was their 4-year-old son. Ethan? I don't remember hanging up. I only remember Robert holding me while we both cried until sunrise. 3 days later, we buried our daughter. Children should never bury parents. Parents should never bury children. And grandparents should never have to explain death to a 4-year-old little boy clutching a worn teddy bear. At the funeral, Ethan kept asking one question. "When is Mommy coming back?" No answer ever felt good enough. That evening, after everyone left, he crawled into my lap. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart? Can I stay with you forever?" I looked at Robert. He looked back at me. Neither of us spoke. We already knew the answer. "Yes," I whispered. "You'll always have a home with us." That promise changed every chapter of my life. The next few years weren't easy. At 60, most people dream about traveling, playing golf, spoiling grandchildren before sending them home. Instead, we were buying kindergarten backpacks and learning cartoon theme songs. Robert loved every second of it. Every morning, he walked Ethan to school holding his tiny hand. Every afternoon, they built birdhouses in the garage. Every night, they read adventure stories before bed. For a little while, our broken family felt whole again. Then life broke us once more. Robert suffered a massive heart attack while mowing the lawn. He died before the ambulance arrived. Just like that, the strongest man I'd ever known was gone. At his funeral, Ethan stood beside me wearing a tiny black suit. He was only 8 years old. As people walked away from the cemetery, he squeezed my hand. "Grandma? Yes? Are you leaving too?" His voice trembled. I knelt in front of him despite my aching knees. I held his little face in my hands. "No, I will never leave you." He threw his arms around my neck. "I love you. I love you more." I meant every word. Losing Robert changed everything financially. His pension stopped. Medical bills piled up. The savings we'd spent 40 years building disappeared faster than I imagined. Friends encouraged me to sell the house. Some suggested foster care. Others thought distant relatives should adopt Ethan. None of them understood. He wasn't a responsibility. He was family. So I sold the house anyway, not to give him away, but to keep him. The money paid off debt and helped us buy a tiny 2-bedroom cottage on the edge of town. It wasn't much. The roof leaked every spring. The floors creaked. The kitchen was so small, 2 people couldn't stand in it together. But it was ours. And for Ethan, that meant everything. I went back to work. At 61 years old, my first job was cleaning office. Buildings downtown from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning. Every night I'd kiss Ethan goodnight before our neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, came over to stay with him. I'd scrub floors, empty trash cans, wash bathrooms, polish conference tables where wealthy executives discussed million-dollar deals. Sometimes they'd still be working late. Few looked at me. Most never learned my name. To them, I was invisible. But every paycheck meant groceries. Every overtime shift meant school supplies. Every aching muscle meant Ethan had another chance at a better life. That's how I measured success. One winter night, I came home exhausted. Snow covered the driveway. The heat had stopped working. I quietly walked inside, expecting everyone to be asleep. Instead, I found Ethan sitting on the couch wrapped in 3 blankets. He'd fallen asleep waiting for me. Beside him sat a handwritten note. It read, Grandma, I tried fixing dinner, but I burned the macaroni. I'm sorry. I saved you the least burned part. Love, Ethan. I laughed through tears. The pot really was burned beyond recognition, but he had carefully placed one tiny bowl on the counter. It tasted terrible. I told him it was delicious. Sometimes love tastes like burnt macaroni. Money stayed tight for years. When Ethan wanted to join Little League, I couldn't afford the registration fee. I cried in the car after leaving the office. I thought I'd have to tell him no. The next morning, the league coach called. Someone had anonymously paid the entire season. I never discovered who. Years later, I suspected Mrs. Alvarez. She denied it until the day she died. Some angels never admit they're angels. Ethan grew into a kind, hardworking teenager. He earned good grades. He helped elderly neighbors carry groceries. Every Mother's Day, he made me homemade cards. One year he wrote, "You're not my grandma. You're every good thing that ever happened to me." I still keep that card inside my Bible, even today, especially today, because sometimes I need proof that little boy once existed. High school graduation arrived faster than I expected. As Ethan crossed the stage, I stood cheering louder than anyone. Afterward, he hugged me so tightly my glasses nearly fell off. "We did it, Grandma." "No," I said, smiling through tears. "You did it." He shook his head. "We." That single word made every sacrifice worthwhile. Or so I believed. College acceptance letters arrived 2 months later. His dream school accepted him. So did the tuition bill. It was more money than I'd ever seen. I stared at the number for nearly an hour. Then I quietly walked into my bedroom, opened Robert's old wooden dresser. Inside rested a small velvet box. My wedding ring. The diamond Robert spent a year saving to buy. I slipped it onto my finger one last time. "I hope you understand," I whispered toward the ceiling. The next afternoon I sold it. The jeweler asked if I was sure. "No," I admitted. "But my grandson's future is worth more than any diamond." That payment covered Ethan's first semester. When he discovered what I'd done, he cried harder than I had. "I'll buy you a bigger one someday." I smiled. "You don't owe me anything." "I do. I promise." He hugged me tightly. "I'll make you proud." I kissed his forehead. "You already have." At that moment, I believed promises made with tears could never be broken. I had no way of knowing. Some promises don't survive success. The first semester after Ethan left for college, I thought the silence would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part was walking past his empty bedroom every morning and resisting the urge to straighten. A bed that no one had slept in for months. His baseball trophies still lined the shelves. His high school graduation photo sat on the dresser. Even his old teddy bear, the same one he had carried after his parents died, was tucked into the corner of the closet. I couldn't bring myself to move any of it. "This house still belongs to you," I whispered whenever I dusted his room. "And it always will." For the first few months, Ethan called almost every evening. He told me about his professors, his roommates, the late-night pizza runs, the impossible math exams. Every conversation ended the same way. "I miss you, Grandma." "I miss you too, sweetheart." It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we were still a family. Then, little by little, the calls became shorter. Instead of an hour, they lasted 20 minutes. Then 10. Eventually, they became quick text messages. "Busy. Talk later. Love you." I told myself that was normal. College was supposed to change people. I just didn't realize how much. One Saturday afternoon, I surprised Ethan by driving 3 hours to visit him. I packed his favorite homemade chicken pot pie and a tin of chocolate cookies. When he opened the dorm room door, his face lit up for only a second. "Grandma, you didn't tell me you were coming." "I wanted to surprise you." He forced a smile. "Yeah, surprise." Inside the room sat 3 of his friends. Expensive sneakers, designer clothes, latest phones. They looked at me politely. Then one of them asked, "Who's she?" For just a moment, Ethan hesitated. I expected him to say, "This is my grandmother. She raised me." Instead, he smiled awkwardly. "This is my grandma, not the woman who raised me. Not my family. Just my grandma." It was such a small difference. Yet somehow it hurt more than I wanted to admit. As I unpacked the food, one of the boys laughed. "Your grandma still cooks for you?" Another grinned. "My grandmother sends money." Everyone chuckled, including Ethan. Not loudly. Not cruelly. But enough. Enough that I quietly closed the container of cookies. That night, driving home alone, I convinced myself I was imagining things. "He's young, Margaret. He's trying to fit in. Don't make this about you." So I let it go. Over the next 4 years, Ethan worked incredibly hard. He graduated near the top of his class with a business degree. The day he accepted his diploma, I cried so much the woman sitting beside me handed me tissues. After the ceremony, Ethan hugged me. "We finally made it." "There you go again," I laughed. "We. There has never been an I without you." Those words healed every tiny wound I'd carried. Or so I thought. Within 2 years, Ethan had become one of the youngest real estate investors in Chicago. He had a beautiful downtown apartment, a luxury SUV, designer suits, magazine interviews. I couldn't have been prouder. Whenever neighbors asked how he was doing, I'd beam with pride. "That's my grandson. He earned every bit of it." I truly believed success had rewarded a good heart. Then I met Vanessa. Vanessa entered Ethan's life like a hurricane. Beautiful, confident, elegant, she came from a wealthy family that owned several hotels across the Midwest. The first time Ethan brought her to my little cottage, I spent 2 days cleaning. I polished every window, bought fresh flowers, cooked enough food for 20 people. When they arrived, Vanessa looked around politely. "It's cozy." I smiled. "It has been home for a long time." She nodded without really looking. During dinner, she barely touched the food. When Ethan complimented my pot roast, she laughed softly. "My chef would love this recipe." My chef. The word sounded foreign in my tiny kitchen. As they prepared to leave, Vanessa pulled Ethan aside onto the porch. I wasn't trying to listen. "But old houses have thin walls. You never told me she lived like this." "What do you mean?" "The furniture. The neighborhood. The house." There was a pause. Then Ethan answered quietly, "It's temporary." Temporary? I'd lived there nearly 20 years. A few weeks later, Ethan called. "Grandma?" "Yes?" "I've been thinking." "About what?" "Maybe you should move somewhere smaller." I laughed. "This place is already tiny. I mean, maybe a retirement community. I like it here. It would be easier." "For who?" Silence. Then he changed the subject. That Christmas, he didn't come home. He sent flowers instead. The card simply read, "Love, Ethan." No handwritten message. No phone call. No explanation. I spent Christmas Eve eating turkey sandwiches alone while old movies played in the background. Still, I defended him. He must be busy. People nodded politely. I think they knew before I did. Spring arrived. Then summer. Then another birthday. Each year, Ethan visited a little less. Each conversation felt more rushed. He always sounded distracted, as though someone else needed him more. One afternoon, I accidentally saw one of his interviews online. The reporter asked what inspired his success. He smiled confidently. "I've always believed in creating your own opportunities." That was true. Then she asked, "Who influenced you growing up?" I leaned closer to the screen. I waited. He mentioned professors, business mentors, authors, successful entrepreneurs. He never mentioned Robert. He never mentioned me. When the interview ended, I quietly closed my laptop. I told myself he had simply forgotten. But deep down, I wondered if successful people eventually rewrite their own history. Months later, Ethan called unexpectedly. His voice sounded cheerful again. "I have exciting news." "What is it?" "I'm engaged." For a second, I couldn't breathe. "Oh, Ethan! I'm so happy for you. You'll love Vanessa once you know her better." I hesitated. "I'm sure I will. I want you at the wedding. I wouldn't miss it." Then he added something that caught me off guard. "And maybe wear something a little more modern." I laughed. "You don't like my dresses? They're just—" He searched for the words. "A little old-fashioned." "I suppose that's because I'm a little old-fashioned." He laughed too, but something about it felt uncomfortable. The wedding was beautiful. Hundreds of guests, crystal chandeliers, fresh roses everywhere. I had never seen so much money spent on one afternoon. I sat quietly near the back, exactly where Ethan's wedding planner had assigned me. Not at the family table. Not beside the bride and groom. Near the back. When dinner began, I watched Ethan greet investors and celebrities. He hugged them warmly, smiled for photographs, laughed effortlessly. Hours passed before he finally reached my table. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I've been so busy." I smiled. "It's your wedding." He kissed my cheek. "I'll make more time after the honeymoon." He never did. Over the next 5 years, Ethan became wealthier than I could have imagined. Magazine covers, television interviews, business awards. People recognized him in airports. Meanwhile, I continued living in my little cottage. I planted tomatoes every spring, volunteered at church, baked pies for neighbors. Life stayed wonderfully simple. Sometimes I'd look at the empty chair across my kitchen table and wonder when success had become so expensive. Not because of money, because it seemed to cost time, memories, family. Then, one rainy Tuesday in October, my mailbox held a handwritten envelope. The return address belonged to Ethan. Inside was a birthday invitation. "Margaret, we're planning something very special for your 70th birthday. I want everyone to celebrate the woman who raised me. Love, Ethan." I read those words 3 times. Maybe, just maybe, everything I feared had only been in my imagination. Maybe my little boy was still there, waiting to come home. I folded the invitation carefully and placed it beside Robert's photograph. Smiling through happy tears, I whispered, "I think we finally get our family back." I had no idea. That invitation wasn't the beginning of a celebration. It was the beginning of the greatest heartbreak and the greatest surprise of Ethan's life. For the next 3 weeks, I felt like a young woman again. Every morning, I crossed another day off the calendar, smiling to myself. 70 years old. I never imagined I'd be excited about that number. But it wasn't the birthday. It was the thought of having my family together again. I spent days planning the menu, even though Ethan insisted he was taking care of everything. Old habits die hard. I still baked his favorite chocolate cake, the same recipe I'd made every birthday since he was 5. Extra chocolate frosting, a layer of fresh strawberries, a tiny baseball made from white icing on top. He was 30 now, but to me he'd always be the little boy who scraped his knees chasing fly balls in the backyard. The morning of my birthday began quietly. The sun poured through the kitchen window. Birds chirped outside. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table where Robert and I had shared breakfast for nearly 40 years. His photograph rested beside my coffee mug. I smiled at it. "Well, Robert, our boy is coming home?" I wish you could see him. The room stayed silent. Yet somehow, I felt as though he was listening. Around 10 o'clock, the phone rang. It was Ethan. "Happy birthday, Grandma." "Thank you, sweetheart." "You ready for tonight?" "I've been ready for weeks." He laughed. "Good. Don't cook dinner. I already baked a cake." "I knew you would." There was a pause. Then he said, "And Grandma?" "Yes?" "Wear that blue dress." I looked toward the bedroom closet. The blue dress. The one I'd bought after saving grocery coupons for almost 6 months. It wasn't expensive, but it made me feel elegant. "You remembered." Of course I did. For a brief moment, he sounded exactly like the little boy I'd raised. By 4 in the afternoon, I was dressed. I curled my gray hair, put on the pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. The pearls weren't worth much, but to me, they were priceless. As I looked in the mirror, I whispered, "Don't cry today, Margaret. Just enjoy it." At exactly 6 o'clock, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. Then another. Then another. Luxury cars lined the quiet little street. My neighbors stepped onto their porches, wondering which celebrity had arrived. People poured out wearing expensive suits and designer dresses. Some carried cameras. Others held champagne glasses. None of them looked familiar. I recognized only one face. Ethan. He walked toward me wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. For just a second, I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after school. He hugged me. "Happy birthday, Grandma." His hug felt quick, polite, almost rehearsed. Still, I held him a little longer. "I'm so happy you're here." "So am I." As guests wandered through my small backyard, I noticed something strange. A professional photographer moved constantly between groups. A videographer adjusted lights near the porch. Someone attached a microphone to Ethan's jacket. I laughed. "Since when do birthdays need a film crew?" Ethan smiled. "People love family stories online. It'll be fun." I wasn't sure what he meant, but I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? More than 200 guests eventually filled the yard. The tiny space I'd spent 20 years caring for looked like an expensive corporate event. Servers walked around carrying silver trays. A jazz band played softly. One woman approached me. "You must be Margaret." "I am. I'm Samantha. I work with Ethan. He's amazing." I smiled proudly. "He always has been." She looked around my little house. "I honestly thought he'd have moved you by now." I blinked. "Moved me?" "You know." She stopped herself. "I'm sorry." Then she walked away. Her words lingered. "Moved me?" As sunset painted the sky orange, Ethan climbed onto a small stage built beside my vegetable garden. He tapped the microphone. The crowd slowly grew quiet. Everyone. "Thank you for coming." Applause erupted. He smiled confidently. "If you know me, you know I rarely talk about my personal life." The audience nodded. "But tonight is different." He looked toward me. "I want everyone to meet the woman who raised me." Hundreds of people turned to look. My cheeks grew warm. People applauded. Some even stood. Tears filled my eyes. This was the moment I'd waited years to hear. Finally, the world would know the woman Robert and I had tried to be. Ethan smiled. "When I was 4 years old, I lost both of my parents." The crowd became completely silent. My grandmother took me in. He pointed toward me. "She worked harder than anyone I've ever known." A tear rolled down my cheek. He continued. "She cleaned office buildings." More applause. I wiped my eyes. Then, his smile changed. "So, imagine being the only kid in school whose parent cleaned toilets for a living." A few people laughed. I froze. Maybe I misunderstood. He laughed too. "I used to pray none of my classmates would ever see her pushing a mop." More laughter. My heart skipped a beat. He wasn't joking. He was telling the truth. His truth, not mine. I spent years pretending she was just my grandmother, because saying she raised me felt— He searched for the word. Embarrassing. The laughter grew louder. Someone whistled. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. I couldn't breathe. Every memory flashed through my mind. Selling my wedding ring. Working night shifts. Burning my hands with industrial cleaners. Skipping meals so Ethan could eat steak after baseball practice. Embarrassing? Ethan kept speaking. Thankfully, life changed. I learned success isn't inherited. It's earned. People clapped again. Then he looked directly at me. "So tonight, I've decided it's finally time for Grandma to enjoy retirement." Relief washed over me. Maybe this had all been leading somewhere kind. Maybe he was buying me a new home. Maybe I'd judged him too quickly. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick manila envelope. The audience watched curiously. He smiled. "I've prepared everything." He walked off the stage and handed the envelope to me. "Open it?" My hands trembled. Inside were legal documents. Dozens of pages. Property transfer forms. Power of attorney paperwork. Real estate contracts. I looked up. "Ethan, what is this?" He smiled as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Just sign them. I've arranged for you to move into a luxury retirement residence. I've already found a buyer for this house." I stared at him. "You sold my house? It's for the best. You don't need all this anymore." The crowd watched silently. Someone whispered, "Just sign." I felt my knees weaken. "This is my home." "I know. But honestly," he lowered his voice, "this place doesn't exactly fit my image anymore." The words struck harder than any slap ever could. My image, not our memories. Not Robert. Not Emily. Not the promises we'd made. Just his image. I looked around the yard. My rose bushes. Robert's old workshop. The oak tree where Ethan learned to throw a baseball. The porch where we'd watched thunderstorms together. Every inch of this property carried our lives. And my grandson wanted strangers to applaud while he erased it. Tears blurred my vision. Ethan, I can't sign these. His smile disappeared. The cameras kept rolling. Grandma, don't make this difficult. I've already announced it. I quietly closed the envelope. No. The single word echoed across the silent backyard. For the first time all evening, the guests stopped smiling. And standing near the back of the crowd, an elderly man in a worn gray suit slowly removed his hat. The moment he saw the documents in my hands, his face turned pale. Then he whispered words that would change everything. No, he didn't. The backyard fell completely silent. Even the jazz band stopped playing. Every camera remained pointed at me. Every guest waited for my answer. I could barely hear my own heartbeat. The legal papers trembled in my hands. Ethan forced a smile, though I could see frustration creeping across his face. Grandma, he said into the microphone, trying to sound calm. You haven't read the whole agreement. I don't need to. It's a beautiful retirement community. I'm sure it is. You'll have nurses, activities, friends. I looked him in the eyes. And what happens to this house? He hesitated for only a second. It'll be sold. So the memories go with it? His jaw tightened. Grandma, memories aren't tied to buildings. No, I replied softly. But promises are. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their phones. Others whispered among themselves. For the first time that evening, they weren't watching a celebration. They were watching a family fall apart. Vanessa stepped onto the stage. Her smile looked polished, almost rehearsed. Margaret, she said sweetly, Ethan is only trying to give you a better life. I looked at her. A better life than the one I've already lived? You deserve comfort. I've always had comfort. She frowned. I placed my hand over my heart. It was called family. Just then, the elderly man standing near the back slowly walked forward. He leaned on an old wooden cane. His gray suit looked decades old, but it had been carefully pressed. His face seemed familiar. Very familiar. Then I recognized him. Frank? He smiled sadly. Hello, Maggie. Frank Donovan. Robert's best friend for more than 40 years. After Robert died, Frank had moved to another state to live with his daughter. I hadn't seen him in nearly 15 years. What are you doing here? I received an invitation. He looked toward Ethan. He invited everyone who had ever known your family. Ethan nodded. I wanted people to see where I came from. Frank's eyes narrowed. I don't think that's what they saw. Frank slowly walked onto the stage. He turned toward Ethan. Son, do you know what those papers remind me of? Ethan crossed his arms. What? The day your grandfather made me promise never to let this house leave the Collins family. The crowd became silent again. Ethan laughed awkwardly. My grandfather has been gone over 20 years. Frank nodded. I know. And before he died, he left something behind. My heart skipped. What do you mean? Frank looked directly at me. Maggie, do you still have Robert's old sewing box? My eyes widened. The wooden one? Yes. It's in my bedroom closet. He smiled gently. I think tonight is finally the night you should open the false bottom. False bottom? I stared at him. What false bottom? Frank looked surprised. He never told you? I slowly shook my head. No. Frank sighed. He wanted you to find it only if your family ever forgot what this house truly meant. Ethan rolled his eyes. This is ridiculous. Frank ignored him. He turned back to me. Go get it. I'll wait. Without saying another word, I walked inside the house. The guests remained perfectly still. The only sound was my footsteps across the old wooden floor. I entered my bedroom, opened the closet, pulled down the faded cedar box where I'd kept sewing supplies for years. Buttons, thread, old photographs. Nothing unusual. I almost laughed. Then I remembered Frank's words. False bottom. I gently lifted the tray, tapped the wood. One corner sounded hollow. My fingers found a tiny notch. I pulled. A hidden compartment slowly slid open. Inside lay a sealed envelope. Yellow with age. My name was written across the front in Robert's familiar handwriting. For my Maggie. My hands began to shake. I hadn't seen his handwriting in over 20 years. Tears filled my eyes before I even opened it. I carried the envelope back outside. Every guest watched silently. Frank nodded. Read it. I carefully unfolded the brittle paper. Robert's words seemed to come alive. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer beside you. My voice cracked. I stopped. Frank gently smiled. Keep going. I wiped away my tears. Knowing you, you've probably spent your whole life putting everyone else first. That's why I'm leaving you one final promise. The backyard was so quiet that the birds could be heard singing beyond the fence. This house isn't just wood and bricks. It's where Emily learned to walk. It's where Ethan took his first steps. It's where our family learned that love matters more than money. I paused again. Even Ethan wasn't smiling anymore. I continued reading. Frank knows the truth about our home. Years ago, I placed it into a family trust. A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Trust? I looked at Frank. He nodded slowly. Keep reading. No one, not banks, investors, husbands, wives, or grandchildren can ever force you to sell it while you're alive. Gasps echoed across the yard. Vanessa's face lost all color. Ethan stared at me in disbelief. I continued. After your time comes, the house can pass only to the family, member who proves they value people more than possessions. If no one does, the property must be sold, and every dollar donated to children's homes for orphaned boys and girls. A deep silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. Ethan suddenly stepped forward. That can't be real. Frank reached into his coat pocket. It is. He removed a thick folder. I've been the trustee for 22 years. Ethan blinked. What? Robert asked me to protect his family. Frank held up official documents bearing signatures and legal seals. I've honored that promise, Vanessa whispered to Ethan. You told me the house was yours. He didn't answer, because for the first time all evening, he realized it never had been. Frank looked around at the crowd, then back at Ethan. Your grandfather wasn't worried someone would steal his house. He was worried someone would forget why he built it. Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time since arriving, he looked like the frightened little boy I'd once held after nightmares. But the night wasn't over. Not even close. Because hidden inside Frank's folder was one final document, a document that would reveal why Ethan had been so desperate to make me sign those papers. And it had nothing to do with my retirement. The silence in my backyard felt heavier than any words could describe. No one reached for another glass of champagne. No one laughed. The cameras were still recording, but the smiles had disappeared. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the envelope in Frank's hands. Vanessa looked from him to me, then back again. Finally, she spoke. Ethan! What is he talking about? Ethan didn't answer. His face had turned pale. Frank slowly opened the folder. Robert had entrusted to him more than 20 years earlier. There is one more document, he said. I hoped I would never have to read it. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Ethan. But tonight leaves me no choice. Frank unfolded a legal letter. This document was written 5 years after Robert established the family trust. He looked at me. Maggie, he asked me to keep it sealed unless someone tried to pressure you into selling this home. I nodded, unable to speak. Frank began reading. If anyone attempts to convince Maggie to surrender this house for their own financial benefit, the trustee must immediately investigate the circumstances before any property decisions are made. The guests exchanged confused looks. Frank continued. If the investigation shows personal financial gain as the primary motive, that person immediately loses all future claim to the family trust. Vanessa's eyes widened. Ethan swallowed hard. One of Ethan's business partners stepped forward. Hold on. Are you saying this trust has assets besides the house? Frank closed the document. Yes. The backyard erupted with whispers. I looked at Frank in complete surprise. There are other assets? He smiled sadly. Robert didn't want to burden you with financial decisions after his death. I don't understand. The trust owns this property. He paused. And several investment accounts your husband quietly built over decades. I felt my knees weaken. Robert invested? Frank nodded. Every bonus, every overtime paycheck, every dividend. He rarely spent money on himself. Tears rolled down my face. Why didn't he tell me? Because he wanted you to enjoy life instead of worrying about numbers. Frank opened another folder. The investments were modest at first, but Robert was patient. He believed in long-term growth. He looked toward Ethan. After 22 years, the trust is now worth... He glanced at the statement. Just over $8 million. The entire crowd gasped. I covered my mouth. 8 million? I had spent years clipping coupons, working night shifts, wearing the same winter coat for 15 years, while Robert had quietly been building a future for us, for our family. Vanessa grabbed Ethan's arm. You told me your grandmother was almost broke. Ethan whispered. I thought she was. Frank interrupted. She was never poor. She simply chose to live simply. I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like Robert. One of the guests finally asked the question everyone was thinking. If Margaret owns an $8 million trust, why was Ethan asking her to sell the house? Frank looked at Ethan. I believe he should answer that himself. Every eye turned toward my grandson. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, his shoulders slumped. He looked at the ground. I made a mistake. Frank shook his head. No, a mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. This was a plan. Vanessa slowly stepped away from Ethan. What plan? His voice barely rose above a whisper. My company is losing money. The crowd became silent again. He continued. The commercial real estate market collapsed. I borrowed heavily. I kept borrowing. I thought one more deal would fix everything. It didn't. How much? Frank asked quietly. Ethan closed his eyes. Nearly $6 million. A wave of shock spread through the guests. My lenders gave me 30 days. They wanted collateral. They knew about Grandma's property. They assumed I would inherit it. Frank nodded. So you decided to speed things up. Ethan couldn't meet my eyes. I convinced myself she'd be happier in a retirement community. You already had a buyer? Yes. The sale would have covered part of my debt. I felt my heart break. Not because of the money, because every word sounded carefully rehearsed. He hadn't made this decision overnight. He had planned it. For months, maybe longer. I looked at him. Why didn't you tell me the truth? His eyes filled with tears. I was ashamed. You've never needed to be perfect with me. I know. You only needed to be honest. He nodded slowly. I know. Vanessa's voice cut through the silence. Is that why you insisted we host the party here? Ethan didn't answer. Is that why you hired cameras? Still nothing. She stepped closer. You wanted everyone to watch your grandmother sign away her home. His silence was answer enough. Vanessa removed the engagement ring from her finger. The diamond sparkled under the backyard lights. I don't recognize the man standing in front of me. She gently placed the ring into his hand. I'm leaving. Without another word, she walked toward the driveway. Several guests quietly followed her. Not because they disliked Ethan. Because they no longer wanted to celebrate what had happened. Within minutes, the expensive party began to fall apart. The jazz musicians packed their instruments. The catering staff quietly boxed untouched food. Luxury cars disappeared one by one. The backyard became peaceful again. Exactly the way Robert would have liked it. Soon only 5 people remained. Frank, Mrs. Alvarez's son Carlos, a young photographer, Ethan, and me. The photographer approached nervously. Mrs. Collins, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Neither did I. He lowered his camera. If it's all right. I deleted every recording. I smiled weakly. Thank you. No one deserves to have their worst family moment turned into entertainment. Night settled over the old cottage. The birthday candles on my chocolate cake had melted into little rivers of wax. No one had even sung happy birthday. I stared at the cake, then quietly laughed through my tears. You know, I forgot to make a wish. Frank smiled gently. Maggie, I think tonight made one for you. Ethan stood alone beside the porch. His expensive suit looked suddenly too large. His shoulders shook. For the first time in years. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a celebrity. He was simply the frightened little boy who had once asked, Grandma, will you ever leave me? Only this time, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and whispered, Grandma, are you going to leave me now? I looked at the child I had raised, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't know how to answer. For a long moment, I couldn't answer him. The backyard that had been filled with hundreds of people only an hour earlier now felt strangely peaceful. The string lights still glowed above us. The birthday cake sat untouched on the table. The roses Robert had planted years ago swayed gently in the evening breeze. Ethan stood in front of me with tears streaming down his face. Grandma, he whispered again. Please say something. I looked at him carefully. For just a second, I saw the little 4-year-old boy who had climbed into my lap after his parents died. Then I remembered the man who had stood on that stage and laughed about the woman who raised him. Both were standing in front of me. I just had to decide which one I believed. Frank quietly touched my shoulder. I'll wait inside. Carlos nodded and followed him into the house. Soon, Ethan and I were alone. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. Do you remember your first bicycle? He looked confused. What? Your first bicycle. He nodded slowly. The red one. You were 7. You were terrified to ride without training wheels. A faint smile crossed his face. You ran behind me. No, I ran behind you for 3 blocks. You kept yelling, don't let go. He looked down. You did let go. I did. You rode all by yourself. And when you realized it, you fell. A small laugh escaped him through his tears. You skinned both knees. And what did I tell you? He answered without thinking. You said, falling doesn't make you a failure. Staying on the ground does. I nodded. I remember. So do I. I stepped closer. Ethan, you fell tonight. He closed his eyes. I know. The question is, are you willing to stand back up? He wiped his face. I'll do anything. I shook my head gently. No, not anything. Only the right thing. We sat together on the old porch swing Robert had built with his own hands. It creaked softly beneath us. I've spent 30 years wondering whether I raised you well. He looked shocked. Grandma, when your parents died, I promised them I'd give you a good life. I tried. You did. I wasn't perfect. You didn't need to be. I smiled sadly. I think somewhere along the way, I accidentally taught you how to succeed. But I forgot to teach you how to lose. He stared at the ground. I didn't know how to admit I was failing. I know. I thought if people found out my business was collapsing, they'd think I was a fraud. So instead, I became one. His voice broke. I traded my character for my reputation. I reached into my purse and pulled out something I'd carried for years. A folded Mother's Day card. The edges were worn from being opened so many times. I handed it to him. He recognized it immediately. I made this when I was 13. Read it. His hands shook as he unfolded it. Inside, written in uneven teenage handwriting, were the words, You're not my grandma. You're every good thing that ever happened to me. He stopped reading. Tears fell onto the paper. I remember writing this. I know. I kept it. I thought those words came from your heart. They did. What changed? He buried his face in his hands. I forgot who I was trying to become. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he looked up. I'm going to tell the truth. To everyone. Not because my business failed, but because I failed. I studied his face carefully. This wasn't the confident businessman from earlier. This was the boy who used to confess whenever he broke a window playing baseball. I believe you? He looked surprised. You do? I believe you're finally telling the truth. The next morning, Ethan called an emergency meeting with his business partners, investors, and employees. Frank insisted on coming with us. "So does your lawyer," he said with a grin. "I've waited 22 years to use these documents." The conference room was filled with worried faces. Everyone expected another excuse, another polished speech. Instead, Ethan stood at the front of the room and took a deep breath. "I've lied to all of you." The room fell silent. "My company is $6 million in debt. I hid the truth. I manipulated financial reports. I tried to solve my problems by taking advantage of the person who loved me most." No one interrupted. "I can't ask for your trust. I haven't earned it. So today, I'm resigning as CEO." Gasps filled the room. "And every asset I personally own, I'm selling. My apartment, my cars, my watches, everything. Every dollar will go toward paying my debts." One investor stood. "That still won't cover $6 million. "I know. But it's where I start." After the meeting, reporters surrounded the building. For years, Ethan had chased cameras. Now he walked straight toward them. One reporter shouted, "Mr. Collins, is it true you attempted to force your grandmother out of her home?" He stopped. He could have denied it. He could have blamed lawyers. Instead, he looked directly into the cameras. "Yes, it is true. And it is the greatest shame of my life." The reporters went silent. "I spent years pretending success meant people admired me. My grandmother spent her life proving success means people trust you." I forgot the difference. That evening, television stations across the country carried the story. Not of a millionaire losing his fortune, but of a grandson publicly admitting his failures. The reactions surprised everyone. Many criticized him. Some forgave him. But nearly everyone praised one person, Margaret Collins, the grandmother who refused to sell her values. My mailbox filled with letters from strangers. Some had lost children. Others had raised grandchildren. Many simply wrote, "Thank you for reminding us what family should look like." I cried reading every one. A week later, Ethan returned to my cottage. Not in a luxury SUV. He drove an old pickup truck he'd bought secondhand. He knocked instead of using his key. When I opened the door, he held out a small paper bag. "What's this?" He smiled nervously. "I got a job." "A real job." "Doing what?" He laughed softly. "Cleaning office buildings." For a moment, I simply stared at him. "The night supervisor said they needed help." "I start tonight." He looked down. "I figured, if the woman I admire most could do it for 20 years, I can do it for a while." I smiled. Not because he had taken the same job, but because for the first time in years, he understood its value. Still, one final lesson remained. A lesson Robert had planned long before either of us knew we'd need it. And it was waiting inside the family trust. For the next 6 months, Ethan disappeared from magazine covers. No interviews. No expensive parties. No luxury vacations. Instead, every evening at 6 o'clock, he clocked in at the same office building where I had once worked. The first week nearly broke him. His hands blistered from pushing heavy floor machines. His back ached from lifting trash bags. The smell of industrial cleaners clung to his clothes. One night he came to my house after work. He dropped into the kitchen chair and sighed. "I don't know how you did this for 20 years. I smiled as I placed a bowl of homemade chicken soup in front of him. "One night at a time?" He nodded slowly. "I used to think people ignored janitors because they weren't important. And now? They don't even look at me." His voice cracked. "I've been invisible all week." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "No, sweetheart. You've finally started seeing the people you never noticed before." The job changed him. Not because it was hard. Because it introduced him to people he had spent years overlooking. There was Mrs. Jenkins, a 73-year-old widow working nights to help pay for her granddaughter's nursing school. There was Luis, who cleaned offices after spending his days caring for his disabled son. There was Denise, who always smiled, even after working 2 jobs to support 3 children. One evening, Ethan called me. "Grandma?" "Yes?" "I met heroes tonight." I smiled. "I know. I've known them for years." As the months passed, Ethan sold nearly everything he owned. The penthouse apartment, the sports cars, the designer watches, the private club memberships. Every dollar went toward repaying his debts. Many people expected him to declare bankruptcy. He refused. "I made these decisions," he told his creditors. "I'll accept the consequences." Some laughed. Others respected him. Slowly, his reputation began to change. Not because he was rich, but because he had finally become honest. One crisp autumn afternoon, Frank called. "Maggie, can you and Ethan come by my office tomorrow?" "Of course. I think it's time." "Time for what?" "Robert's last instruction." The next morning, Ethan and I sat across from Frank in his small law office. He placed a thick leather binder on the desk. "This is the complete Collins family trust." He smiled at Ethan. "Your grandfather was a very wise man." Frank opened the binder to the final page. "I've been waiting more than 20 years to read this." He cleared his throat. "If Ethan is hearing this, then life has already taught him lessons I could not." Ethan lowered his eyes. Frank continued. "Money has a strange way of revealing character. If you ever value wealth more than people, you will lose both. But if you learn to value people first, then no amount of money can ever make you poor." The room was completely silent. Frank turned another page. "There is one final condition." He looked directly at Ethan. "The trust can never be inherited automatically." Ethan nodded. "I understand." "No, I don't think you do." Frank slid another envelope across the desk. "Open it." Inside was a handwritten certificate. At the top were the words, "The Collins Family Foundation." Ethan looked confused. "What is this?" Frank smiled. "Your grandfather never intended the trust to make one person wealthy. He intended it to make many people hopeful." Frank explained that Robert had written detailed instructions decades earlier. "Half of the trust would remain in my care for the rest of my life, ensuring I would never have to worry about money again. The other half could only be used for one purpose: helping children who had lost their parents, just like Ethan had. There would be scholarships, emergency housing, school supplies, counseling, mentorship, everything Robert wished every orphaned child could receive." Tears streamed down Ethan's face. "He planned this all those years ago?" Frank nodded. "He never stopped thinking about you." Ethan looked at me. "Grandma, I don't deserve any of this." I smiled gently. "No, you don't." He nodded. "I know. But maybe I can spend the rest of my life earning the chance to help someone else." Frank smiled. "I believe that's exactly what Robert hoped you'd say." Within a year, the Collins Family Foundation opened its doors. It didn't have a fancy office. It operated out of a renovated community center. The walls were covered with children's drawings instead of expensive artwork. Every child who walked through those doors received more than financial help. They found people who listened, people who cared, people who remembered their names. Ethan personally mentored teenage boys who had lost their parents. He never began with business advice. He always began with the same sentence: "I know what it feels like to think you're alone." One Saturday morning, I visited the center. A little boy named Noah ran up to Ethan. "Mr. Collins, I got an A in math." Ethan knelt down and gave him a high five. "I'm proud of you." The boy hugged him tightly. Watching them together, I suddenly saw the little 4-year-old Ethan again. Not the millionaire, not the businessman, just a frightened child who had finally found his way home. As we walked outside, Ethan looked at me. "Grandma, I used to think success meant owning buildings." He smiled through tears. "Now I think success is building people." I wrapped my arm around his. "Your grandfather would agree, but life still had one more surprise waiting for both of us. A surprise that would make my 71st birthday the happiest day of my entire life." 1 year passed. It was hard to believe. Sometimes, I would walk through my little cottage and think about everything that had happened. The house was still the same. The old porch swing still squeaked. Robert's workshop still smelled of cedar wood. The rose bushes he planted continued to bloom every spring. The only real difference was the peace inside my heart. Not because I had forgotten the pain, but because forgiveness had finally found a place to live beside it. Forgiveness doesn't erase scars, It simply keeps them from controlling your future. The Collins Family Foundation had grown far beyond anything we imagined. More than 300 children had received scholarships. Dozens of grandparents raising grandchildren received emergency financial assistance. Families who had nowhere to turn found hope again. Every month, Ethan personally visited the children. He never wore expensive suits anymore. Usually, he arrived in jeans and work boots. He still worked part-time cleaning office buildings. Not because he had to, because he refused to forget where true dignity comes from. Whenever people recognized him and asked why he still cleaned offices, he smiled and answered, "That job built the woman who raised me, and I'm proud to honor her." On the morning of my 71st birthday, I woke to the smell of pancakes. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. I slowly walked down the hallway. When I opened the door, I stopped in my tracks. The kitchen was full. Frank stood by the coffee pot pretending he knew how to cook. Carlos was burning bacon. Mrs. Jenkins laughed as she rescued it from the pan. Several children from the foundation were decorating the table with handmade birthday cards. And standing in the middle of it all, wearing a flower-covered apron, was Ethan. He turned around and smiled. Not the smile he used for magazine covers. Not the one he practiced for business meetings. The smile I hadn't seen since he was a little boy. "Happy birthday, Grandma." Before I could say a word, he wrapped me in the longest hug we'd shared in years. "I love you." The words were quiet, honest, without cameras, without microphones, without an audience. Exactly the way love should be. After breakfast, Ethan asked everyone to follow him into the backyard. I laughed. "You're not trying to make me sign papers again, are you?" His face turned red. "I deserve that." Everyone laughed. Even me. He led us beneath the old oak tree where he had learned to throw a baseball with Robert. There stood a small wooden bench, beautifully handcrafted. I ran my fingers across the smooth wood. "Did you make this?" He nodded. "Well, I had a little help." Frank laughed. "A lot of help." Carved into the back of the bench were the words, "Love is the only inheritance that grows when you give it away." Robert Collins. Tears filled my eyes. "I found Grandpa's old woodworking plans." Ethan smiled. I wanted to finish something he started. Then he reached into his pocket. This time it wasn't a legal document. It was another envelope. "Go ahead," he said. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Not typed. Handwritten, in Ethan's own handwriting. It read, "Dear Grandma, last year I stood in this backyard and tried to take away your home. This year I want to give something back that can never be bought. Thank you for every night you worked while I slept. Thank you for every meal you skipped so I could eat. Thank you for selling Grandpa's wedding ring so I could go to college. Thank you for never letting me feel like an orphan. You didn't just raise me. You saved me. And when I forgot who I was, you saved me again. Everything good I become for the rest of my life will always belong to you and Grandpa. I love you. Forever your grandson, Ethan." By the time I reached the last line, I couldn't see the page through my tears. The children from the foundation gathered around me. One little girl tugged gently on my sleeve. "Miss Margaret?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "Mr. Ethan says you're everybody's grandma." I laughed through my tears. "Did he now?" She nodded proudly. "He says families don't always start together. Sometimes they choose each other." I looked at Ethan. He smiled. He had finally understood. That afternoon, we planted a new oak tree beside Robert's old one. A small bronze plaque rested at its base. It read, "The Collins Family Tree. Its roots are sacrifice. Its branches are forgiveness. Its fruit is hope." As Ethan shoveled the last bit of soil into place, he looked toward the sky. "I hope Grandpa can see this." I slipped my hand into his. I think he's smiling." A few weeks later, Ethan received an invitation to speak at a national business conference. Thousands of young entrepreneurs filled the auditorium. Everyone expected him to explain how he had built a successful company. Instead, he walked onto the stage carrying an old mop. The audience looked confused. He smiled. "This is the most valuable business lesson I've ever owned." He told them about a grandmother who cleaned office buildings, about sacrifice, about honesty, about losing everything that mattered because he chased things that didn't. At the end of his speech, he said, "If success costs you the people who love you, you're not succeeding. You're failing." The audience stood and applauded for nearly 5 minutes, not because of his wealth, because of his truth. Years later, when people asked me what I received for my 70th birthday, I always smiled. Some expected me to mention the trust, or the foundation, or the millions of dollars. Instead, I always gave the same answer. My grandson gave me my family back. Because in the end, the greatest inheritance Robert left us wasn't a house. It wasn't money. It wasn't even the family trust. It was the courage to remember that people are always worth more than possessions. And that's a lesson that changed not only my grandson's life, but mine as well.